Thank you all for coming here this afternoon as we meet in Treaty 6 territory in the homeland of the Métis on a very, very cold day. I don't think we broke the record today, but very cold. I want to thank you all for coming because not only is it really cold, but I know there are an awful lot of other really interesting events going on this week, including today in some of our other social science departments. So we really appreciate that you've taken the time to come and join us here today. Okay. This is the fifth and final lecture in what I think has been a really, really interesting lecture series this year around the theme of archaeology and anthropology in an era of engagement and reconciliation. So we clearly saved the best for last. Okay? The whole point of this lecture series was to look at the idea of reconciliation through the lens of our discipline, which in many ways was the very first one to engage with Indigenous peoples at the community level, acknowledging that many mistakes were made in the early years, and also providing an opportunity to detail how we have responded as a discipline to many of those concerns and how we do our work today. So this is the last. Please stay tuned because when we recover from all the activities of this year, we will certainly be putting our heads together to see how this particular theme can be advanced again into the future. Before we get going, I'd like to thank the support of the College of Arts and Science and the Dean's Office in particular, and thank Vice Dean Dirk de Boer for joining us today as well. Their financial support has allowed us to film each of the lectures to be posted on the department's website and on its Facebook site, I guess in perpetuity. I don't know how long anything lasts anymore, but these will be available. This one should be up and running probably within a few days. That seems to be how long it takes. So thank you very much to the College of Arts and Science for supporting us during our 50th anniversary year. Okay. So it is now my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Dr. Terence Clark, or Terry. And I'm just going to touch upon a few of the more salient biographical aspects of his career so far, because there's a lot to talk about here, and he's certainly going to talk a lot about his own work for us. So he did get his PhD from the University of Toronto with a focus on Northwest archaeology. Before he came here to the University of Saskatchewan, he was the curator of Western Canadian archaeology at the Canadian Museum of History. And in and around all of this, I didn't even know this, but he has been involved in Greek archaeology, and he's the lead curator on an exhibit called The Greeks, Agamemnon to Alexander the Great, which is a partnership with National Geographic and the Field Museum in Chicago. Yeah, good. And this is the largest and most important exhibit on Greek history and culture that has ever left Greece. So I had no idea. I'm impressed already. But he's also the director of the Shishalh Archaeological Research Project, which is a community-based partnership with the Shishalh Nation in British Columbia. He's the author of many books and articles and book chapters, and has done a lot of media interviews, including, I found out, Forbes magazine, which must be the list of 100 richest archaeologists. Anyway, he's developed a variety of different statistical packages for his archaeological research and mobile applications for archaeology as well. And he more recently has been involved with the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, where he's been working particularly recently anyways with the Muskogee First Nation to help find the lost children of the residential school experience. And this has been in several different media packages as well. And finally, also to my surprise, I learned recently that he's a space archaeologist. And I wasn't really sure what that meant, but he says this is work that he does out of Egypt and Oman, which I always thought was on Earth, but nonetheless. I'm absolutely thinking that we have a Pekka Kucha presentation in here somewhere on space archaeology. But today, most importantly, he's going to talk about his important work primarily, I assume, in Canada, where the title of his presentation is Archaeology as Reconciliation, Community-Based Heritage Projects in Canada. Terry?
Thanks, Jim. Thanks, everyone, for coming. I want to give a special thanks. I would reiterate all of your comments about thanking everyone, PETA and Arts and Science and everyone, but I want to turn the attention to you for organizing this series. I think we've all really enjoyed it. It's an honor to be the last speaker in it. So Jim already mentioned this, but I'd like to say it again. As we gather here today, we acknowledge we are on Treaty 6 territory in the homeland of the Métis. We pay our respect to the First Nation and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. Why I think this is so important is archaeologists recognize and demonstrate the long-term connection between Indigenous groups in Canada and their lands. This is what we study. This is our bread and butter, and this is really, really important to us that all of the academic disciplines recognize this and support this. All right, so what I'm going to talk about today, here's a brief overview, quick introduction. I'm going to talk about reconciliation and how it's going to affect archaeology and anthropology. I'm going to focus primarily on my Shishalh archaeological research project, but I'm going to look at it through a number of different lenses so you can see how this project is advancing the cause of reconciliation. As Jim mentioned, I'm working with the Muskowgan First Nation and looking for the lost children. I'll talk about that project and where that whole series of projects are going to go in the future. And then I'll hopefully give a vague idea of where this is all leading, where archaeology and anthropology as disciplines are going to be moving forward in this era of reconciliation. So starting with me, as Jim said, I'm a Northwest Coast archaeologist. I've been doing this since 1994. My field training is very for-field. I went to a master's program where I had to take graduate courses in linguistics, in cultural anthropology, in physical anthropology, and in archaeology. I'm very comfortable in the for-field setting, and as we'll see, that makes sense for the Northwest Coast. During my degrees, I worked extensively in cultural resource management or contracting archaeology all across British Columbia, eventually managing one of the bigger companies in the province. I was also curator of Western Canadian archaeology at the Canadian Museum of History, and we'll see how that has affected some of the work that I talk about today. Recently, I've been working on novel ways of using new technologies to tell the story of archaeology and heritage to people. This is with mobile apps, both in Greece and in Saskatchewan. And lastly, as Jim mentioned, I do space archaeology. This is really a misnomer. You're not going in space to do archaeology, and you're not doing the archaeology of the moon, sadly. You're just using satellites to look back at Earth and look in amazing detail through the Earth's surface to see what archaeological resources might be there. And satellite archaeology just doesn't sound as sexy, and so we call ourselves space archaeologists. All right. So as a quick background, the Northwest Coast is a bit different than most areas of Canada. The contact history is much later, and so there are no European explorers on the Northwest Coast in the city of Victoria until 1790. And so if you compare that to the east coast of Canada, there's 250, 300 years of contact before then. And so we've got this amazing, it's a short history of contact. At the same time, we get the development of North American anthropology and archaeology. It's happening almost at the same time. In a short succession, within a few decades, we have anthropologists working on the coast shortly after this period of contact. Chief among them is Franz Boas, the father of North American anthropology, really committed to the Northwest Coast, working with George Hunt, documented many of the cultures of the Northwest Coast. Here he is pretending to climb out of a door in a Kwakwakiwak house that was recreated for the World Exhibition in Chicago. So he's pretending to perform the Hamatsa dance, which they hired Kwakwaka'wakw actors to come and perform for everyone in Chicago. A contemporary of Boaz, a colleague of his, was Harlan Smith, who did the archaeology, principally did the archaeology associated with this early research, and did it across the coast, especially in the Salish Sea region that I'll be talking about today. They worked together through a program called the Jessup North Pacific Expedition, and this was funded by the American Museum of Natural History and created thousands and thousands of pages of documentation of the cultures of Siberia, of Alaska, and the Northwest Coast. Not only were they looking at cultural anthropology, and there was a lot of that, there was a lot of material culture studies, this was really four-field anthropology. You'll see that there's some archaeology involved, there's human remains involved, there's language especially involved. All of these things were being documented in a very major way shortly after the contact period. And so that's fundamentally different than most areas of North America. Now, as we look back with the lens of reconciliation, we can see that this is not a perfect, ideal situation. That the work that was being done by the American Museum of Natural History was salvage anthropology. They believed that these cultures, these people, were dying out, that smallpox, influenza, cultural contact itself was going to wipe them out. And so this work was done to record as much as humanly possible before these peoples went extinct. A lot of the cultural objects and human remains that were experienced during the Jessup North Pacific Exhibition were taken without permission or consent, and they were displaced to museums around the world. And so you can go to any museum in Europe, whether it's Berlin, Paris, London, you can go to New York, Chicago, Ottawa, they all have objects, totem poles, masks, human remains from this period. They were all taken and spread across the world. That being said, we do have an unparalleled record on the Northwest Coast when we talk about all of the documentation that went into the collecting of these objects. And so often you just have collection records, they're gone. Here we kind of know, in a lot of cases, where things came from. That there's truly deep ethnography here. Boaz especially was a proponent of cultural relativism, and so he just wrote a lot of stuff down. I think in Kwakiutl texts, there's something like 26 recipes for blueberry pie, because whenever somebody told him something, he just wrote it down, which is great. But we can't accept this stuff as unbiased, because it wasn't. What Boaz and his contemporaries did was come to a village. George Hunt would set this up, and they would talk to the chiefs about whatever the chiefs thought were important. And so that meant that a lot of topics were never discussed. The role of women, for instance, was not a topic that is common in any of these early ethnographies. As Madonna Moss points out, that means that we focused our attention for 100 years in kind of the wrong direction. We focused on salmon, for instance. That's a male's activity. And we've completely ignored clams until very recently. And so that's a female activity, that's an activity for children, and an activity for slaves, clam digging. And so we get a completely skewed view of the past if we only rely on these ethnographies to tell us what's going on. So it's a tremendous record, but we have to view it critically. We have to understand what it says and what it doesn't say. Where are the gaps, and perhaps why there are gaps in the record. So I'm going to summarize how first cultural resource management archaeology is happening in Canada. Up till this point, things are already changing, but certainly in the recent past, this is how sort of consulting archaeology, and this is the bulk of archaeology in Canada. This is probably 80+% of the digs that go on, the artifacts that are found, is not academic, it's professional archaeologists. And so the way that it's worked, especially in my experience, is that archaeologists are the intermediary between development and indigenous communities. We're kind of stuck in the middle. And the reason that we're stuck in the middle is that previous policy was to consult and accommodate, which meant that developers, whether this is a highway, a pipeline, a dam, a housing development, whatever it is, that proponents would have to talk to Indigenous communities, they'd have to consult with them, but there was really no impetus for them to act on any of those things. So this accommodate thing was a bit of a joke. And so it meant that a big proponent could say that we want to do this, we hear your resistance to it, but we're going to do it anyway. And so the opposition to these big projects was often just swept under the rug. And archaeology was one of the only avenues that people had to actually stop projects or significantly change them. So they'd be approved, archaeologists would go out, CRM archaeologists, they'd try to do a survey, figure out what was there, and there'd be tremendous pressure from communities to find important sites if they were in disagreement with the project, or find burials. They would please find something that's going to stop this project, because nothing else, their voices aren't being heard. And then on the other side, companies that are paying the bills are saying, don't find anything. Don't make us reroute this. Ignore what you're finding. And so archaeologists were really stuck in the middle of this really contentious issue where there was no other voice to deal with resistance. So in terms of academic archaeology, it's a bit different. Projects generally needed community support. That government, in Canada, the permitting system goes province by province and by the territories, and so there's no federal system. There's only provincial permitting systems. Generally, they ask for some community input. Does the community support this or not? Depending on the province, some of that is much more rigorous and some of it is completely ignored. The limitations on academic archaeology were really more ethical than legal. So if I wanted to work with a group and they said, no, we don't really like that, I could get a permit through the government and do it anyway. I probably wouldn't, because that would make me feel bad. I might look bad amongst my colleagues, but there was no legal requirement for me to listen. It's just an ethical concern. Certainly some projects, many projects had much deeper engagement than this. Mine, for instance, but there are many, many others going back years that have deep engagement. But I think a lot of them were essentially, we'll talk to you when we need you. We'll come out in the field, the beginning of the field season, we'll sit down with chief and council, talk about what we're going to do this year, and then the rest of the year, you don't answer the calls. You just kind of let the community go. And so this was really the baseline, bare minimum of what was acceptable for academic archaeology. And then this comes along. And so you'll see that I'm going to have a few slides with a different background. I'm going to take some information directly from these two books. So the summary of the final report of the TRC and the calls to action. And when I do, I want you to see that this is not me talking. I'm not proposing a new way forward that's so different than what's out there. I'm saying I'm taking it directly from these documents. And so the way forward's already there. So I'm just going to point that out. So the first one I'll talk about is the definition of reconciliation. So here, taken from the summary report, reconciliation is about establishing and maintaining a mutually respectful relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people in this country. In order for that to happen, there has to be awareness of the past. We have to understand what has happened. We have to acknowledge the harm that has been inflicted, atonement for the causes, and we have to action to change our behavior. And so we've talked about, and our reconciliation statement does this well, we've accepted that archaeology and anthropology in the past has been problematic. And that the work that we've done over the last few decades has been working to address that, and we have to do more in the future. So I'm going to pull out a couple calls to action as we go, kind of as they make sense. This is the first one, and this is probably the most difficult one in there, I think, in terms of the broader Canadian society. So we call upon federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal governments to fully adopt and implement UNDRIP as the framework for reconciliation. So you may not know what that means, but I'll point you directly to what is going to be the problematic cause, or the problematic clause in UNDRIP, and that where we're going to spend a lot of our time thinking about in the future. So states shall consult and cooperate in good faith with Indigenous peoples concerned through their own representative institutions in order to obtain their free, informed consent prior to the approval of any project affecting their lands, territories, or other resources, particularly in connection with the development, utilization, or exploitation of mineral, water, or other resources. So what this means is that in the new archaeology of reconciliation, we need free, prior, and informed consent. And so that goes completely against what we had before, which was consult and accommodate. So now you actually need permission, and it's not based on archaeology. So theoretically, and I don't know if this is actually going to happen, the Supreme Court will rule on this, projects can be stopped or changed by the wishes of Indigenous communities, in theory. So archaeology, I think, is going to take a different role. Rather than being this road bump that is kind of stuck in the middle and that tries to slow down projects, if you're, or the communities are asking them to try to slow down projects, it may be free of that burden or pressure because communities can just decide they don't want to do it. They don't need archaeology as an excuse anymore. They can just say, no, we don't want this dam or whatever it is. So it's possible, and I'm hopeful that this will be the case, it may be decades down the road, CRM archaeology may be more informational and less adversarial. We'll see. The bulk of my talk is going to be about academic archaeology, and so that's really all I have to say for CRM. In terms of academic, we're going to have to go much further. The idea that we can show up once a year, parachute in, get permission, and move on is not going to fly anymore. We need active, informed participation in developing research questions. So from the very beginning, what are we going to study? That's going to be important. We need involvement in the field work that meets the needs of the community, input on analysis and interpretation, and multiple research outputs. I'll kind of go through these 4 points as I go. I think that these are fundamentally important and are going to structure academic disciplines moving forward. So, and lastly, we need to share the benefits of research with the community. I'll talk a little bit about how that happens as well. All right, so why is this important to me and why am I here today? Because the Shishalh Nation has signed a foundation agreement. This is the first reconciliation agreement in British Columbian history. And here we have our department signing our own reconciliation statement. So my project, for good or bad, will be the first in the legal framework of reconciliation in Canada. So before I talk about what we're doing, I want you to know that this didn't come out of thin air. We didn't immediately change our minds on how to do archaeology just because of reconciliation. That working together with the Shishalh Nation, this goes back to 2012, these were our project goals. And I think that you'll see that we've had a deep commitment to many of these principles for a while. So you can see that names have changed here. So to strengthen collaborations between the Shishalh Nation, University of Toronto, where we're getting all of our grad students from, and the Canadian Museum of Civilization, now history, but that's where I was, to further knowledge about the long-term use of Shishalh lands and resources by investigation and documentation of archaeological sites and material culture, to provide skills training to Shishalh members and University of Toronto students in the principles of archaeology and heritage stewardship, to increase awareness and respect of Shishalh history within the community, and more broadly in regional and academic discourse. So it was really important to us. A number of archaeological sites were being vandalized, and so it wasn't just doing stuff for the Shishalh Nation. We wanted to tell the broader community about the importance of heritage and why it needed to be respected. To facilitate the exchange of ideas and experiences between the nation, University of Toronto, and the museum. And then lastly, to introduce Shishalh youth to potential careers in social sciences. So it was really important that we mentor students and try to bring them along in the process, let them know that they weren't just hired as summer interns, but there was a future in archaeology or anthropology if they wanted it. All right, really briefly, for those of you who don't know anything about the project, it began in 2008. Last year was our 10th anniversary. I became the primary director in 2011. So far, we've had 6 completed masters and 1 completed PhD. We've got 2 current masters who are in this room, and a few more expected in September. We've operated for a number of years a training program for Shishalh youth, which I'll talk about how that operated. And it's really drawn from undergraduates, graduate students, and interns from around the world, Canada, the US, Brazil, and the UK. All right, so the Shishalh Nation is here on the Sunshine Coast, just north of Vancouver, on the mainland. It's not accessible by road. You have to take a ferry from North Vancouver over to Gibsons, and then there's lots of roads there. And so it's, although it's very close to Vancouver, it's a bit more inaccessible than you would think. Here are the Shishalh lands. Traditionally, the Shishalh were 4 different groups that all spoke the same language, Shishatlam, but recognized separate identities. So Hunichin, where we'll be this summer, Tsonai, where we were last summer, Twonk, where we've spent many years, and Squeakwas, where we've also poked around a bit. So really importantly, Shishalh Nation is different, I think, than most nations in the country. They were the first First Nation in all of Canada to get self-government in 1986. And I talked to a grad student about this today. Most other nations thought they were crazy. They thought, what have you done? But it's worked out very well for them. And since then, many other nations have got self-government, some following the Shishalh model, and others going in a different direction. And as I mentioned, they're also the first First Nation to sign a reconciliation agreement just last fall. So this means that they have unprecedented control over their lands. They can own lands, they can develop lands, their resources. They control now what happens in their forests, in their waters, their heritage. They have their own permitting system for archaeology. They have their own museum to house it. Their education system is under their control, and they teach from K to grade 12, and then in university, the Shishatlam language. Social services, businesses, really importantly, they're a wealthy nation because they invested in businesses, and they're able to support my research in funding and taxation. So we've excavated at a number of sites. We haven't just focused on one. I'm not going to talk about them all. In fact, I'm only going to talk about the ones that are in bold. So Chatlich, Sihalt, I'll mention a little bit at Porpoise Bay. Quantum I'll spend a fair bit of time on. This is the most famous site in Shishalh lands, and with good reason. Salalas, Sexwamen, Storm Bay, Zuni Narrows, not going to talk about any of these. Hohuihuan, I'm going to talk about in very vague terms. This is a very spiritually important and significant site where we did work, but we're not really allowed to talk about it. And so I'm not going to give you any details. Olthkayam, where we've spent the last couple summers, defensive sites. Tsonai, where we were this summer. And then Shelkem, I'll also mention, again, a very spiritual site that you're not going to get a ton of details. All right, so in terms of the archaeology of reconciliation, I mentioned 4 kind of main attributes that we're looking at, and I'll kind of go through these in order. First, developing research questions. So starting at the very beginning, what are you going to research? There's many, many questions out there, tons of sites. What's important to the community? What are their concerns? Actually conducting the research, how that's done, analysis and interpretation, and then creating research outputs. I'll kind of go through these in order and then show different parts of the project that I think are ticking these boxes quite well. So in terms of developing research questions, we'll start at Quentin Macaulay, which translates as to the Leaders Cemetery. This was discovered in 2001 by Shishalh archaeologists. One of our grad students was doing survey and found all of these beads, and that obviously got us pretty excited. This generally indicates the presence of a burial, and so we were worried about erosion. We talked with the nation, chief and council, and they asked us to remove it. This was an area that kayakers frequented, and so it was better in the nation's eyes to remove it and protect it rather than it being picked apart, beads being grabbed, bones being taken by these kayakers. This turned out to be enormously bead rich. This one individual had about 350,000 stone beads, and that is the most bead rich burial known in North America for any time period. So once we removed the burial, or the beads, and then the burials, we saw that we didn't understand how to tell this story. This was a data point. We've got all of these other burials, all of this other evidence for status and equality on the Northwest Coast. It's all down here. And then we have one data point that's so far and above anything that we can imagine, there's nothing to compare it to. And so we explained it would be tough for us to tell this story. And the community was really interested in what this meant, who this person was, and so asked us to go and dig more. So we actually spent 3 field seasons, and 3 full field seasons there, and then a number of follow-ups over other years to go and get information to tell the story of Quentin Macaulay and the ancestors there. So I'm going to kind of go through what we found really quickly. So this first chief, the burial from 2010, was certainly male, older aged, 50 plus, height 5'7". This was actually among the tallest ever recorded on the Northwest Coast before contact. Of a sample of 2,500, this was in the top 5 because there's no carbohydrates, and so people aren't tall. They're eating lots of protein. They're much smaller. This is probably 6 inches taller than the average person at this time. Heavily muscled based on his skeleton. Like I said, 350,000 ground stone beads, 10,000 ground stone shell beads, or ground shell beads, sorry, a necklace and other grave goods. So quite rich. So here are some of the items. Mostly I wanted to show you the beads. Each bead is not necessarily beautiful. They're made out of mudstone or siltstone or slate. Based on our replication studies, maybe 6 minutes per bead. And so the entirety of this burial is equivalent to 23 human years worth of labor. And this is dated at 4,000 years ago. About 1.5 meters away from him was the burial of a woman. We weren't sure, is this a cemetery? Is this a one-off? It is in fact a cemetery. It was a young woman, 19 to 23. She is much smaller, but if she ends up being 5'3", we don't know because of preservation, then this would actually put her several inches taller than the average population as well. There you go. Less beads, but a lot of elaboration nonetheless. So 5,700 ground stone beads, 3,200 ground shell beads, necklaces, bracelets, ear spools, and other really interesting grave goods, which I'll point out in a second. So her stone beads are twice as big as his, whatever that means. She had olivella bracelets. These would have been bright purple in life when they're first harvested, and so she had one on each wrist. Ear spools, one in each ear. And then amazingly, these small, very finely made shell beads. The finished diameter on some of these is 1 millimeter or less, and so you'd be hard-pressed to make these with modern tools or get thread through them. So we actually had to split thread when we did a reconstruction of these, probably woven into her hair. They're so finely made. And then she also had these really large projectile points, purposely broken, never used, very well made. So really interesting, carefully arranged with her. And so we found all 4 tips here on her knee, and then 3 of the 4 bases. Unfortunately, the bank was eroding right here, and so the 4th base was never found. But it's pretty obvious that there was one. These other 3 fit very well back together. All right, just fly through this. Also really interesting, about 1.5 meters away from her was a double burial found in 2012. This was 2 young men in their 20s, biologically very similar and buried in the same grave pit. They're also very tall. So we have 3 of the top 5 tallest people on the Northwest Coast ever found. So that's probably not a coincidence. They have, the 2 men have identical impacted wisdom teeth and cranial sutures. We weren't able to do DNA on them to figure out how they might be related, but we think they have to be brothers and that they might likely be twins. If they're brothers, then they're, as you would call them, Irish twins, that they're really close in age. This is not a picture of human remains. This is just a 3D model that I did to show the community. So this is just it's just a 3D model. But what I wanted to show was that our burials are spread across this landscape. In the middle is this large rock feature. This is a carved large stone in the shape of a canoe. And then we have this big, massive rock. At the center, it's dished out. And we see multiple layers of ash. This seems to be an altar, or in Coast Salish tradition, it's important to have food for the dead, feeding the dead. And so you have food and you burn it during the funerary rites, and then the smoke takes the food to the afterworld for the recently deceased. And so it looks like this has got multiple burnings, whether that's one for each person at the site, or if it's returning on anniversaries to reburn and give food for all of them. All right, so it was really interesting. At first, archaeologists from around the world loved it. They thought it was fantastic. Oh my God, you're doing amazing stuff. And then they kind of took a step back and were worried that we shouldn't be doing this. That as kind of settler archaeologists, the time for digging burials was over. That they couldn't do this in their communities. And so they wondered, would this affect our reputations if we kept doing this? What's interesting is that the community was completely on board. They were unwavering in their support. They wanted to know the story of these people, and so it was never a question to them. And so when I doubted it myself, should we be doing this? I said, it's not up to me, and it's not up to my colleagues to say this is not appropriate. The community says it's appropriate, and they're the only ones that matter. These are their ancestors, and so the decision was made to keep going. So I think that the archaeology of reconciliation would support this kind of research as it uses archaeological data to help tell the stories the community wants to know about. That our work has to move towards their needs. In terms of other research questions, I'll talk really quickly about Porpoise Bay or Shishalh. This is a large ethnographically known village. And we wanted to demonstrate long-term resource management here. This is known for a very large herring run that happens right out in front of the village. It was known as the herring fishing village. And so here it is. It's very close to Shishalh. It was really easy to work there, and so that was wonderful. Here's the town of Shishalh. So we were interested in the intensity and antiquity of herring use. The reason that we were interested in that is because the community wanted to know. They were negotiating with fisheries and oceans about fisheries management. And so they wanted us, we could ask any question that we wanted. And they said, why don't you look into that? Can you look into the herring fishery and show that we've been doing it for a long time? And so that was easy for us to do. And so I think also archaeology of reconciliation has got to support this kind of work where we focus on the needs of the present community. Like I said, there's tons of research questions. Why not make it one that's relevant to the people that are still living there? So here are just some pictures of us working there. So another one, and I alluded to this already, this is Ho'ohuehuan. So we had actually spent the whole year planning to work at Olthkayam, a defensive site where we've subsequently worked. Because it seemed associated with Porpoise Bay. So this Porpoise Bay is the big village, and in times of resource or in times of raiding, people would leave and go to this refuge site to be protected in this defensive site at Olthkayam. And so that was a really interesting question for us. But 3 weeks before the field season, a new site was found, Ho'ohuehuan, and then we changed everything immediately. This is a cairn cemetery. And so this is a cemetery where only shallow pits were dug, remains were placed, and then large piles of rock were put on top of the individuals, probably to show territoriality, show the status of people. Some of these are massive piles, bigger than cars. Some of them are quite small. These are sacred, and they're very visible. Other cemeteries on the coast, there may not be anything to see, and so it's protected. You don't need to worry about it. But here, they're very visible. If you're walking through the woods, you notice a pile of rock that's taller than you. And if you see this, you're likely to poke around and see what it's all about. So this was really concerning. Development had come close to the site, and now we needed to react. We needed to figure out what was happening there. So we moved all of our field excavations to Ho'ohuehuan. We actually spent 2 summers recording, mapping, and excavating there. But this was all under the notion that we were never going to publish this, that it's too sensitive, that these remains are on the surface, and if anyone knew where it was, then it was going to be problematic. People could poke through and disturb these graves. And so we took that on, knowing 2 years of our research was not going to end up in a final project or a product that was going to be recognized academically. And so I think an archaeology of reconciliation supports this kind of work, that it's sacred and sensitive and acknowledges the value of research that does not have traditional research outputs but benefits the community. And in our department, we've just worked through our standards for tenure and promotion that recognizes this community-based approach, and that there might be outputs that are different than a journal article, but equally valid, and that we need to do. All right, I think the last one under this heading is Quis-Cham. And this is a female puberty petriform site where essentially young Shishalh women would carry stones up a mountain and created moon circles. And so they took stones, climbed a mountain, and then made a circle of them where they learned from elder women about puberty and what it meant to be a woman and all of the tasks that they would need to take on. These are none of that. This is all just published stuff, so you can see that Salish women's puberty is really important, and they do it in a lot of ways. So our stone circles are something like this. Ours might be more dramatic, but I'm not going to tell you about them. What I am going to tell you about is that these were also under threat. There were trails getting too close to the site. Rocks were being removed and reoriented. It seems like these days, anytime people see rocks, they want to build an inukshuk, and so not great. So features were being damaged. The nation asked us to record the site before there was any further damage and establish a baseline. So if we took enough photos and drawings that if someone were to go up there and move rocks around, that we could put them back, that we knew where the rocks went. This was a student of mine, a master's student, Leah Iselmo, fantastic project. And what I think is the most amazing part of this is the ethnography, well documented that Salish women are doing this, that this site is known in the ethnography. It was written down as Quis-Cham. And what that means when she went and sat down with the elders is, what's the question? And so clearly, Lester Peterson, who's recording all of this, had no idea. He asked a question, and then an elder said, "Pardon me?" And he wrote it down. Oh, that's the name of the site, I guess. So his grasp on Shashishatlam was not perfect. So the actual name that we now know, and we've updated all of the maps, is Shelkim. So we went through, recorded, photographed, mapped the entire site. This is a very four-field project. Leah met with elders and interviewed them about their knowledge of the rites, as well as young women who continue to maintain the tradition there. And again, this is not something that we're going to publish. It's just something that was important to the community and needed to be done. And so we won't talk about its location or the description or any of the rites that we know happened there. And I think that it's really important that an archaeology of reconciliation supports this kind of work as it records and protects sacred knowledge. All right, conducting research. We did an indigenous training program for a number of years. We paired university students with Shishalh youth, often in the same unit like this. And we brought interns from Shishalh Nation to the Canoe Museum of History. This was really important to create a connection with the community. I think I'll talk about that in the next slide. So university students acted as mentors. They mentored students that were just a few younger. So these were first year or second year university students and high school age Shishalh students. So they were close in age. And Shishalh youth acted as community ambassadors. So through this training program, a number of our students went on to get jobs in the field. We got connections that really helped us in building trust relationship with elders. And we got elders out to the sites repeatedly that were really important for our students, but also for the youth. So this is Trevor Julius. We've had his whole family out to site. His father, Keith, is a counselor and has done archaeology. Trevor and Daryl both worked for us, and now Karina, his sister, is also an archaeologist. And this is great, and it shows these connections. This is Joseph Cragen, one of our students. He's got the joy of discovery. He just found this decorated brow band, very excited. And the next year, his grandfather was elected chief. And so we didn't have to tell the story of why we're important. He's heard it. He knows that archaeology is exciting. All right, the summer fun program. So the Shishalh Nation runs its own summer camps. We routinely bring the students out to work with us. They learn traditional knowledge and language skills. They're deeply involved in archaeology. And we're also invited, because we're members of the community now. There was a poll raising a couple of years ago that I was asked to be an official witness. And here's the horizontal poll that was created. So I think it's really important that an Archaeology of Reconciliation supports this kind of work, as it shares the process of archaeology with the community. There's no secrets, it's all transparent. All right, I'm running behind, so I'm going to speed up if that's possible. All right, so returning to the TRCs for a second, 31.1 says, Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain, control, protect, and develop their intellectual property over such cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expressions. And so that means the stuff that we dig up doesn't belong to us. I think that should be fairly self-evident, but it's the intellectual property of the descendant communities. So when we were working at the Museum of History, we were worried, or we wondered, could we do, we've got all these amazing burials, can we do anything with this? Could we include this in a museum exhibit? The museum was redoing itself with massive renovations, and they really wanted to bring the individual into history. And so we decided to do facial reconstruction. We developed a museum exhibit at the museum. It's on display at the Canadian Museum of History in Ottawa and at the Thames-Swaya Museum, both permanent exhibitions to our research. And this was not done independently, this was done with deep community involvement. So facial reconstruction is a very big red flag for a lot of museum professionals, because there's a lot of horrible reconstructions out there. They look dated very quickly, and they can be quite offensive. And so here's one that's not good. Here's one that's awful. This is Kennewick Man that looks like Jean-Luc Picard. Here's probably the worst one I can think of. And so just because you mean to do well doesn't mean that you're going to do well. And so we knew that this was something that we had to do right. But we knew that there are people, this is Magdalenian woman, that the Field Museum did. They can be done really, really well. And they cost a lot of money. But we were prepared to do that. So because we wanted to do all of the adults at Quentin Macaulay, that we just simply couldn't afford to do it, and we didn't have enough space to do it. And plus we had to do it in 2 different museums. So we wanted to create a photorealistic portrait. And because we're doing it digitally and 3-dimensionally, we can actually animate these slightly. We got the best guy in the world, Philippe Froche from Visual Forensic. And so here he's used to doing only kings and queens of Europe. And so this is the work that he does. This is not a photograph, this is a 3D model. You can move this model around and take images from any direction. So unbelievable work. We wanted to give Philippe as much information as we could. We created reference packages based on the archaeology. The community wanted this to be as accurate scientifically as possible. So all of the biological detail, we talked to the community about hairstyles and clothing and all of this kind of stuff. And then we actually 3D scanned all of the artifacts so that you would have 3D models to actually base them on. So here we've got, we didn't know what she'd be wearing. That didn't preserve, and so we just decided on a cedar shawl. That was a possibility. 3D scanned all of that stuff and sent it off to him. We got members of the community to collect photos that fit these ranges, 50-plus-year-old men, 20-something-year-old women, so that we could kind of see. Philippe had never done an Indigenous person, and so he just needed some reference images. Laser scanning this stuff. Each hair follicle is modeled individually, and so you can imagine the amount of time. We spent many weeks talking about facial hair and how a Coast Salish facial hair is a certain way. Everything, as I said, was 3D scanned and incorporated. Unfortunately, we scanned the ear spools and placed them, and then in the final render, we actually moved her hair so it covers them, so you can't actually see that, but I just wanted you to see that we covered all of our bases. Here are the beads woven into her hair. We think that the massive number of beads that the first chief had were likely woven into a cape or a robe. And so I had my student Leah sew them together, or sew a small patch together, 3D scanned it so that we'd have texture to create that. And so basically, the research outputs that we have, we're talking about museum displays, new technologies. I'm not going to talk about apps, there's no time. Community events, which I will talk about briefly, and publications. All right, so the big research outputs from this project were museum displays. So here we have the opening at the Canadian Museum of History. Here's Maswaya, a really important elder who came out to do a ceremony. He's overwhelmed at seeing the faces for the first time. I just want to show you this because it's great. So these are three-dimensional models, and so because of this, we were able to actually let them breathe and move and blink. These are installed on a 55-inch monitor, and so they're actually bigger than life size. You can get right up to them, and they kind of breathe in your face. It really brings the past to life and gives a feeling that these were once living people in a way that archaeology often doesn't get that. I think we were able to get that. Okay, so we opened at the Temswaya Museum. My research was on a cake, which is fantastic. That's never happened before. And here are the beads. The museum in Ottawa said, no, we don't want any grave goods, just carte blanche. We think that it's too problematic. We don't want any questions about it. But in Shishalh, they said, well, it's our beads. And we want to show people. Everyone's asking, how many beads is that? And you tell them, well, it's about the size of a bathtub. This case is 7 feet long and 3 feet wide. And this is about half of them. We only took the full beads. The ones that were broken or the bead dust, there's another 35 liters that's underneath the case here. But we didn't want to trick anyone. We didn't want to put the dirt down and then pile the good beads on top. It's still very overwhelming to see the quantity of beads. And then we have all of the other things. Here are the smaller beads that were woven into the hair, the different ear spools right there. This got tremendous press. So here's Forbes, as we said. National Geographic ran with this, Smithsonian. So all to say that Archaeology of Reconciliation supports this kind of work as it places on equal footing the research outputs desired by the community as those recognized in academia. And so this has to be seen as on par with articles or books. All right, so another thing that we do as a community output is Shishalh Archaeology Day. This is a community open house to show off our finds, to focus on our students and our interns, and to get community feedback. This is really important to help us shape future directions of the project. So here's Olenka talking about artifact replications that we did this summer. We've got artifact tables, kids' activities, and we get the whole community out and serve them Chinese food. But that's what they like, and so that's important. This kind of work, I think, is important. Archaeology of Reconciliation should support this kind of work as it understands the reflexive nature of community-based work and values ongoing input from the community. So this is not showing up once and asking permission and then la la la. It's coming back constantly saying, are we doing it right? Can we do it better? Do you want us to do something different? All right, really quickly, I'm almost done, don't worry. Article 85, or in the calls to action, is actually focused on APTN. And so here it's asking APTN to continue its great work, and especially in this bottom part, continuing to develop media initiatives that inform and educate the Canadian public and connect Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canadians. So we filmed 2 episodes of Wild Archaeology. This is APTN's highest rated show in its first season. And so here we are filming with the elders and with summer fun. The kids are out here coming in the canoe. We've got songs and dances. This is really sort of exploration of culture as well as the archaeology. Here's Rudy Reimer and I, the host, talking about the burials at Quentin-Macaulay. And here they're in the museum learning about how the work was done, the displays were made, all this kind of stuff. So look for this in the fall. We've got 2 episodes coming up. And they did some 3D stuff, so there'll be some virtual reality content available on the web. So an archaeology of reconciliation supports this kind of work as it recognizes that reconciliation is not just about Indigenous people, that reconciliation must perform outreach and education to the settler community about Indigenous people. We might kind of lose that thought, but that's really, really important. So the last project I'm going to talk about, Jim alluded to, and this is calls to action 71 to 76. I take this from 75. We call upon the federal government to work with provincial, territorial, municipal governments, churches, communities, former students, to look at procedures for the ongoing identification, documentation, maintenance, commemoration, and protection of residential school cemeteries or at other sites where the lost children might be buried. And so this is a project with the Muskowgan residential, or the Muskowgan First Nation. It's led by the NCTR and the nation. And what we're trying to do is find the lost children. So at most residential schools, there are some marked graveyards, but many unmarked graveyards. And so there are a lot of children that are just not accounted for. This is in direct response to the TRC calls to action, 71 to 76. It was important to the community that we didn't dig them up, that they had already been disturbed, that they wanted to know where their remains were, and they didn't want to disturb them any further. And so we used ground penetrating radar as a means to find areas of disturbance consistent with a grave shaft. And we outlined a number of those and then moved on from there. This, I think, at its heart is reconciliation archaeology. So here's us doing this. Is Keisha Supernant, my collaborator from the University of Alberta, with her equipment. I'm kind of watching. And then we got a call when we're in Muskowgan to be on CTV News live in 2 hours, and so we had to drive really quickly back to my house and get ready for our live interview. So I think this is really important to the public consciousness these days, and certainly more work will continue in that. Just to follow other residential school work that I'm doing, we call on the federal government in collaboration with survivors, Aboriginal organizations, and the arts community to develop a reconciliation framework for heritage and commemoration. And so in 2 weeks, I'm going to the University of Calgary to be in a SSHRC-funded workshop on developing a strategy for commemorating and preserving former residential schools in Alberta. This is being led by the University of Calgary, Pete Dawson, and the Old Sun Community College. And so what we want to do here is understand that there's 150 schools in Canada, and that most of them have been knocked down, that there has to be lasting markers for those memories, that the settler Canada needs to understand that this happened, and that by knocking down the building, those memories don't go away. And so we need a way to commemorate these schools. So I think an archaeology of reconciliation supports this kind of work, as academics should offer any expertise available to help in the process of healing and commemoration for the survivors of residential schools. So moving forward, the era of reconciliation is upon us, that there's no going back, that the way we do archaeology and anthropology is certainly changing, and that there's no manual for conducting an archaeology or anthropology of reconciliation. This is going to be a work in progress. We don't really know where it's going to go. And there's probably going to be hiccups along the way. This is a whole new way of seeing the world, and not just in archaeology and anthropology, across universities, across governments. Reconciliation is going to fundamentally change how we engage with the rest of our population. And so I don't think it's going to be a smooth transition. I think that we're going to learn as we go. That as archaeologists and anthropologists, we're also changing the way that we engage with the public, that social media, news articles, and television are just part of the game now. It used to be if you got a news interview, that was a huge deal, but now it's it's what's expected, and you really need to get your stuff out there and talk about what we're doing. That new technologies, I didn't really talk about it, but I'm working on a bunch of apps that are going to bring heritage to the people around the world and on campus. So people have Indigenous place names, for instance. It would be really important for people to see Indigenous languages. And so I think a better informed public is good news for us and for reconciliation. So none of my projects were done by myself. I've always had huge teams supporting me. So I'm not going to read all of these people out, but to the institutions, individuals, students, interns that I've had, thank you so much. Shishalh.
Absolutely fascinating, and we've got some time for some questions, so let's open it up for questions and responses.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, like, logistically, how your master's students went around the confidentiality things. Like, was it any of that confidential information in her thesis? And then with her community or committee members?
So she was at Carleton. We went through the ethics protocols there, but the Shishalh Nation have their own confidentiality agreements. And so I signed on her behalf, and then she signed another one about data usage. And so what was really important, most universities want to destroy that stuff after 3 or 5 years, whatever it is. The nation does not. They want archives of that stuff. And so essentially the nation's agreement trumped everything. And we just said, this is how it's going to be. Her files are being transferred to them, and they're going to house it in perpetuity. Yep.
So you were talking about the height differentiation and how they were quite a bit taller than normal. Can you speak a little bit more to what the social and cultural significance of that would have been? I'm not very familiar with the culture itself and whether or not that had anything to do with the burial goods that you found.
Good question. We're not really sure culturally what it would have meant. Certainly the first chief being a lot taller, he would have been towered over his colleagues, and he was quite muscled as well. And so I'm sure he was an imposing figure. I think the point that we're trying to make by telling that the other two men were also very tall, that we're inferring that they're related, that it's unlikely that they're unrelated at this stage. We don't have, we didn't do DNA, and so we can't necessarily compare, but given the massive amount of wealth here, this is probably a scribe status, and that's probably a family.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks very much for this really interesting presentation. I do have a question that kept going through my mind about it, which is the archaeology of reconciliation involves consent and taking direction from the community.
Yep.
What do you do in a situation where the community cannot reach a consensus about the role of archaeology within the community?
That's an excellent question. Luckily, we've never had to deal with that. We've had broad-based support. We've talked to the Chief and Council, the Elders Council, and the community, but it is tricky. But one thing I'd like to say is that the previous model, you'd probably be stuck because you're just doing it ethically and there's some concerns, you don't know how to deal with them. With the Shishalh Reconciliation Agreement, there's actually protocols for how to deal with this. And so if there's disagreement, there's a council on culture that has 3 members selected, or up to 3 members from the provincial government and 3 members from the Shishalh government, and then they decide. And so in some ways, this should give us more satisfaction because there is a legal proceeding. Not that I would ever, if the community said, no, don't do it, I wouldn't want to take them to the arbitration, but you certainly could. And so with reconciliation, I think there's actually going to be a way to solve that. I could see an issue is if you had a student going through their PhD, they got 4 or 5 years in all of their data, and then something came down. That might be a reason to say, okay, let's talk about arbitration. Let's try to figure out a way forward instead of cutting them off. So, yeah, I think that it might get better in the future in those cases.
Should we be calling the St. Mungo beads Shishalh beads?
That's a good question. We honestly don't know what's going on 4,000 years ago. This is not the only bead-rich burial. There's one with 54,000 beads and one with 11,000 beads. So there's sort of other analogs, but the idea that those are near the Fraser River and they could be a result of intensive salmon harvesting, that was easier to understand. In Shishalh lands, there's no big salmon fishery at all. And so this is not a direct relationship of economy, wealth accumulation, and this display of status. There's something else going on there that's different.
So in Saskatchewan, we have like nomadic hunter and gatherers. What can we, like, there's kind of a disconnect between who's the ancestors to these sites. So how can we go about figuring that out?
That's an excellent question. I feel like Dr. Walker has some ideas about that. I certainly don't know. Following the NAGPRA model would be whoever's there now. I don't think that that's the best solution necessarily when we know that there's population movement, especially from Saskatchewan down into the States. And so, I don't know. Like I said, it's a work in progress, and I feel like there's some obvious hiccups coming, and I think that's going to be one of them, where we've got to repatriate remains, and we don't know who's there. And archaeologists say, well, we think that there's this historical movement, 500, 5,000 years ago, whatever it is, and groups saying, well, we don't want to do DNA. And so there's going to be problems for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, well, underneath NAGPRA, that depends on what point in time it is, right? Because they have that 1996, November 16th, 1990 as the cutoff between museum collections or collections processes and then the other side, which is the land disturbing one. And that one usually goes with the jurisdiction, but then they also have that caveat that says, or the most culturally appropriate tribe.
Yeah. In British Columbia, they don't seem to be that sophisticated. It tends to be whoever's there was there at 1846. And so that's the magic date in the sand. And that if you're there in 1845, then you were there since time immemorial. And if you're there in 1850, then you were never there. You don't exist. And so that's really problematic, especially when we get the building of Fort Victoria in 1843. And so massive populations of Haida, Tlingit, Kwakiwak people coming down, living in Songhees territory, and theoretically having a claim or not having a claim. It's really unclear whose territory that is. Yep.
Just following up on the collection side, I know this is the new process going forward, but has this helped gain any impetus for actually repatriations within British Columbia, especially within Canada and BC, but also outside of it? Because as you said, it's not just like, the Americans, the ones there, but they also went global.
I think that generally repatriation is seen as a positive step for most museums around the world. When I was in London, though, I met with a curator at their British Museum, and she was very proud of herself that the Haida remains had just been returned to Haida Nation. And so I asked her about the mortuary poles and grave goods, and she said that that was illegal, that there is no mechanism because the British Museum is written into Parliament, and so there's no way to deaccession artifacts. And so she's like, no, those can't go back. And I said, well, those are the tombstones. That to the Haida, it means the same thing. And she said, nope, not going to do it. And so I feel like, again, this is going to be something that is going to be litigated, is going to be discussed for years before people understand that mortuary goods are important, just as important as the bones.
Terry, it's comments more than a question. You're bringing to my mind what it was like, in my case, 47 years ago. We're talking about the 50th anniversary.
Yeah.
And how things have changed. For instance, in this department, I don't remember how many there were, but we had a burial collection. The grave site from around Swift Current.
Yep.
And I think it was over 100 burials from an archaic period, which was really something else, not that many. And they were in our collection, and I, at that time, as a young assistant professor, got to know some First Nations people locally, including a lot of people that were members of AIM, A-I-M, and American Indian Movement. And one of them told me they were so mad about this that they were actually considering raiding
the department to
Yeah.
take these burials and repatriate them. I know later Ernie was responsible for having them repatriated. But even myself, one of my first pieces of work was in the Northwest Territories for Indian Affairs and Northern Development. And in retrospect, I have to confess, it was sort of like a Malinowskian East African colonial study on behalf of the Department of Indian Affairs, for better administration. And then I remember one time sitting in my office and a young Cree man went by and said, I noticed in your curriculum you're teaching Cree, and that's my native language, and you have no right to be teaching Cree, because on my reservation, anthropologist is a swear word. So it was one of the reasons, that kind of context, where I decided to try and use my anthropology in other contexts, because it seemed at that time almost a no-win situation. I couldn't figure out a way to get out of this mess, this conflict. And the field has come such a long way since then, and I guess a lot of people don't recognize the crimes, misdemeanors, or lack of respect in retrospect that was carried out back then.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So.
Yep.
You said that the amount of work done for all the beads took 23 years of work, you said?
We think 23 human years of labor to make all of those beads.
Okay. But that would have been done all at once or over an individual's lifetime?
I can't imagine it's one person. This guy did not make those beads. There's no way. I think this is a lot of different people. We think that, I kind of alluded to this, that it was probably woven into a garment, or at least a lot of them. So that would be about 70 pounds of beads. If it was woven onto a cape, probably 100 pounds, and the size of a king-size bed sheet. So this is not something you wore every day. This is like the Pope's robe. This is what you bring out for ceremony, for ritual. And so I'm sure that there's lots of people providing beads to this person for that garment.
Any more questions? Well, if not, Tara, I want to thank you very much. I think this was an absolutely perfect way to conclude. I think that addressing very directly the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was tremendously insightful and really carves a path for all of us to see how we should always continue to look into that important document and see how our own work can promote the idea of reconciliation. Because there's an awful lot in that document that can certainly give us a pathway forward. And I mean, as a discipline, I think we're doing a lot of good things. There's always more to do, and we're going to keep it up. And what you're doing here is absolutely fabulous. I want to congratulate you, because this is actually leading edge stuff. So I want to thank you all for coming out this afternoon and participating on and off throughout this 50th anniversary year for the department. So thank you very much.